I just read that you've retired as a Beatles expose artist after 8 years of analysis. So why don't we just start there? Obviously, you're still talking about it, but you must feel that you're able to put this thing to bed. So why don't we start like 8 years ago, uh, where you were at and how it all began?
Okay, so I did retire the ongoing day in and day out research back last November, and I will do talks about the research if somebody reaches out to me and would like to talk about it. So I'll still do that. So it started, well, just to begin by letting the audience know, Jason, that I was a huge Beatle freak as a kid and growing up. And the Beatles are the reason why I picked up a guitar. They're the reason why I wrote my own music. It's the reason why I recorded my own music. And so that clicked along for a very long time.
Right. So when just I'm interested actually in the minutiae here. You're obviously probably about my age or something like that. So the Beatles were disbanded by the time you got into them. What was your entry point to the Beatles?
1968 when Yellow Submarine came out. So they were still a band because I was bugging my parents to take me to go see the film when I was a kid. I was 9 years old. I'm 66
Oh
years old.
yeah, yeah, you're younger than you look then, right?
I was born in 59.
Right.
And so I bugged them and bugged them. And my brother, who was 14 months younger than I am, he was also into the Beatles. So my father, I'm sure reluctantly, took us both to the movie theater to go see this crazy animation. And as a kid, I didn't realize it was an animation. I remember being disappointed until the end of the film when the Beatles themselves came out. Then it was worth the price of admission just for that 5 or 10 minutes at the end of the movie. And I knew about the Paul is dead conspiracy. In fact, when I was in high school, I had organized a Paul is dead talk where the brother of a friend of mine, he was 5 years older than we were. His name was Doug, and he knew all about the clues on the album covers and the backmasking and all that stuff. And I was so intrigued by it. So I organized this little lecture for Doug to come in, and I didn't think there was going to be a lot of people who were going to attend Doug's talk, but I was wrong. When it was time to start, it was standing room only in the classroom, and I remember it was very fascinating. He brought a record player in, he was playing the tracks backwards and pointing out all of the clues on the album covers. But to me, I thought that the whole Paul is dead theory or conspiracy was nothing more than a clever and witty marketing ploy by the Beatles to engage with their fan base.
Right.
I always thought that Paul was Paul.
What year was that then that the Doug did the presentation?
Doug did the presentation in 1976.
So it had been around for 7 years, the Paul is dead theory.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Wow. It still had legs.
It still had legs. And especially amongst the people that the Beatle fans, the Beatle freaks. I considered myself to be a Beatle freak. At one time, I had so much Beatle memorabilia that my brother would come to my house and say it was a Beatle shrine. And I had everything. I got rid of a lot of stuff, even my vinyl collection. I had a vinyl collection of Beatle records from across the world that would rival anybody's collection of Beatle vinyl. And over the last year, I sold off approximately 75% of it just to clear things out because having done the research, I now know, I'm not even going to say that I believe, I now know that the Beatles were not what we were told that they were. And so what happened was I clicked along, still thinking that Paul was Paul. The whole Paul is dead thing was nonsense until 2016 when I bought the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears. And that book came out in 2009. So in 2016, I was 7 years late to the party. That's when I finally caught up with the book. So I bought the book And on the Amazon site, it explains that it's historical fiction. And I just thought it was going to be an enjoyable read. Really didn't expect much out of it. I was just curious. But when I read the book, it hit me very quickly that whoever wrote this book or wherever the source information came from, there was so much information that only somebody within the Beatles' inner circle or the person playing the part of Paul McCartney, claiming to play the part of Paul McCartney, Billy Shears, had something to do with the book. Because the amount of information about Beatle history, about songs, and all of that was just too much to chalk it
And
up. Yeah, yeah.
is there a specific, because I read the book, I got it on my shelf, and I wasn't, frankly, I wasn't convinced, although I'm very open to the Paul is dead thing, and pretty much always have been, and I'm kind of more than half convinced on that. But something about the book didn't quite persuade me. So I'm curious, like what
Well, tell me what it is that didn't
example?
persuade you.
Well, that would take longer, I think, than what I was going to ask you. But it's something to do with the presentation overall. Like if it really was somebody who's a multimillionaire who wanted to get the truth out, I'd expect something a bit more prestigious. It just has the flavor more to me of a hoax. There seems to be, and to me, it's not either or. Actually, I mean, I don't want to take up too much time with my point of view because I want to hear yours. But to me, it's not necessarily either or because I think you have the mainstream narrative, the official narrative which has all these holes in. And then there's this other narrative, I call it the second matrix, which is also somewhat manufactured and takes elements of the truth, but creates a counter narrative. And I try and sort of slip between the two.
Yeah. And by
So
design, by
yeah,
design. The book
right,
is written like that by design. In the beginning of the book, I believe, if it's still in the introduction, it talks about the book being uh, basically it's not mainstream. We know this. It's self-published, and the reason why that's done actually goes right in line with what Billy is all about. So Billy is all about uh, puzzles. He's about creating something that is not straightforward, something that's going to make people think, that's going to make people, the intrepid, investigate, to take it a step further. In fact, the book implies throughout the narrative, based upon the fact that it is historical fiction, it tells you that, tells everybody that right up front, that if you want to find the truth, then you're going to need to dig deeper. You're going to have to go outside the book in order to discern whether the book, what it's telling you, is fiction or whether it's nonfiction. And this is what happened with me.
right.
When I was reading the book on one of the prior editions, I don't know if it's still page 350, it was the blue covered book, not the red. Uh, it talked about how George Martin was going to take the Beatles songs, their little songs, and make them big. I'm paraphrasing. And when I read that passage, I remember thinking to myself, that was a very strange passage because aren't Paul McCartney and John Lennon supposed to be the most prolific genius songwriters of all time in pop music? So why would George Martin have to make their little songs big? And then the next page, it goes into the Committee of 300 and the snitch. So the snitch is Dr. John Coleman, who wrote the book on the Committee of 300. And so that was an invitation by the book in a very, very subtle way to take the reader from here inside the book to outside the book in order to fill in more of the blanks.
Right.
Um, the book is, there are passages in the book which are coy, that are cryptic, and that's by design. It's explained that the book has to retain plausible deniability because of non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, that both Tommy Harriet have signed and that Billy himself has signed to play the role of Paul McCartney. In fact, in the book, having, I know you said you read the book, he talks about the fact that if he breaches these contracts, he could wind up in a lot of hot water as far as, especially from the perspective of his financial security and the security financial security of his children because they're going to inherit his wealth. So there's this fine line that is being walked throughout the book. The other thing about the book, the way it has been put together, it's very clever. What the nonfiction many times is defined, excuse me, the fiction, I should say, the fiction is defined what people don't want to believe. So when the book talks about the Beatles and their connection into the ideology and the philosophy of Aleister Crowley, and I'm not talking about each Beatle individually, the Beatles as an entity, because they were immersed and still are in the occult. If somebody doesn't want to believe that the Beatles had anything to do with Aleister Crowley, then that part of the book is nonsense. It's fiction. If people don't want to believe that he played the role of Vivian Stanshall in the Bonzo Dog Band with Neil Innes, for those of you who don't know, Neil Innes was the one of the main um, uh, players in the band The Ruddles, which was a Beatles parody band. If you don't want to believe that, then that part of the book is fiction.
But do you think there might be things in there that some people do want to believe, but that are fiction, if you see what I mean, that make it more
Oh, it could be. It could
titillating, but
be.
also less credible. Because I know people who, well, like yourself, we've just met, but I know other people who are fully sold on the whole thing, and I know people who are utterly dismissive. I'm sure you know plenty of those too, right?
Of course.
And as I say, I definitely lean towards your interpretation. I wouldn't be talking to you otherwise, but I understand why some of these people are dismissive because they're not just normies who are Beatles fans. They might be very learned about conspiracy, but they consider this one a step too far, and that's
And
what
why,
I've
why,
seen.
why, why do they feel that way?
Well, I think it has to do with this that there's a narrative that's been created that seems a bit too tidy somehow. Whereas, I mean, when I've listened to your presentation, we'll get to it today, but what I like about what you've done is you're looking at the official narrative and just basically assembling all the inconsistencies and the anomalies that don't add
Right.
up. And that's persuasive to me. However, when a narrative is generated out of that, or if it's done prematurely, then I feel that well, maybe you've had this experience, you can lose the attention of the listener because they say, well, wait a minute, Aleister Crowley. I mean, I've done a lot of study of Aleister Crowley, so I know a lot about Crowley. I find it entirely credible the Beatles were immersed in Crowleyanity because he's everywhere. That
Yep.
that Paul McCartney was Crowley's son, however, I don't buy that. I mean, it's possible, but that just sounds like it's too hard to verify, and
But the
it's
book doesn't state that.
okay, but it's in there, isn't it? It's in the sort of
It alludes to the possibility. In fact, I've had a researcher that I'm connected into, Stacy, who found other clues embedded and coded in the book that tied Billy's family back to the Douglas Hamiltons, the Douglas Hamilton bloodline, Scottish blue blood bloodline on his father's side, and his mother's side back to the Percys. And the Percys have Campbell blood. And in the book, Billy tells us that he has Campbell relatives. So this is the thing. This is the piece of the book. Um, I don't want to say the piece of the book. This is when you read the book, you cannot just take it at face value, which is what too many people are doing. They just want to read the narrative and say, okay, I read the book and I either believe it or I don't believe it or I don't know. That's like the three camps.
yeah.
But the book is encoded. And I've explained it so many times on my shows that if you really want to dig in, you have to understand, catch the points where it is encoded. Like I mentioned with my piece on the music, most people would have read that, and I did at first too, and blew right past it about George Martin making their little songs great. But then something caught, something that pulled me in, like, hold on a second, there's something to this. And this is the same thing that Stacy did when she looked at the book and looked at other clues that were embedded and encoded. And then she took the work, like I mentioned, to the Douglas Hamiltons and the Percys as his bloodline. See, here's the other thing, Jason, that I find. There's a lot of people that consider themselves to be into the alternative research, um, everything is a conspiracy. So there's so many things that they will call out, and many times rightfully so. But when it gets to this, when it gets to the Beatles or it gets to the Rolling Stones, that's when they step back.
Hmm.
Everything else can be a conspiracy. Everything else can be a deception, but
Well,
not this.
now it's Donald Trump. Now Donald Trump must be what he seems, and but anyway,
Yeah,
it's whatever
yeah.
people are emotionally invested in. Of course, it's
It's what they're invested in. And the thing is, we have to keep in mind that the music industry and the entertainment industry is completely controlled. It's a major tool in the toolbox of the controllers.
yeah.
So
No,
to think,
I'm absolutely. I mean, I've written books about it, so I'm absolutely persuaded of that myself. I don't want to keep reiterating, but I do feel that there's also a disinformation thing, which is um, a kind of conspiratainment. So there's a lot of
yes,
researchers out there, right, who dumb it down in a way that makes it sexier and more, they get more clicks, but they might also be disinfo agents who are deliberately mixing up the truth with the false.
absolutely.
Right?
That's all around us.
Yeah. So I mean, we'll get to let's get to Robert Soul in a minute because I definitely want you to have a chance
Sure.
to lay out some of the the nitty gritty. But as long as we're on this question of what we could trust and what we can't, what were you able to find out about John Coleman? Because I don't think I've ever found anything confirming that this guy was what he says he was, or and so much seems to come from him as this original source that can't be checked. So were you able to verify anything around him and his claims?
All I can go by from John Coleman is the books that he's written. He's written books on the Committee of 300, on the Club of Rome, on Tavistock, um, on Freemasonry. And when people come to me and say, well, Coleman used an alias, we don't have a definitive background on Coleman. Coleman doesn't use citations in some of his books. Like in particular, we'll talk about the Committee of 300. So my response back to folks is that read his books and tell me where he got it wrong.
That can be hard, though. I mean, if he's making claims that are completely new to you, uh,
But if you go back, his books were written many years ago. So the Committee of 300 was written back in the early 1990s. It's 30 years ago. Read the book today, and then to fast forward 30 years to today,
yeah,
and where did he miss the boat? Did he get a couple of things wrong because maybe the controllers shifted things up as far as their strategy? Yeah. But most 90% of what he's got in that book transpired over the past 30 years. Now, somebody could say, well, that's revelation of the method and he's controlled opposition and all that stuff. But you know what? What does that have to do with the fact that those things happened? And you could have read about it 30 years ago. See,
sure,
people fall back on this thing where they say they want to discount something or they want to discount somebody by saying things like they're controlled op, we don't know much about them, we don't know this, we don't know that. But there's a body of work. So look, just read the body of work and let that be the main driver as to whether this person has credibility. Now, I don't know. Could Coleman have been controlled opposition? Sure, he could have been. But even within controlled opposition, there's always truth.
absolutely. Yeah, well, it's 90% truth and 10% lies is disinformation. But in this present example, a question would be, what if the 10% lies includes the Beatles Tavistock narrative? I mean, I know you've confirmed it in your own way, so we're going to get to that. But just that I have a question mark around the how the narrative got started.
Yeah.
So, right, people refer back to this, but then uh, right, it doesn't.
Well,
That can't be checked.
I don't say that the Beatles were a creation of Tavistock because John Coleman said they were a creation of Tavistock. You have to understand Tavistock.
Hmm.
Take John Coleman out of the equation
Yeah,
and understand what Tavistock was all about. Understand what the Frankfurt School was all about. And then you start putting it together.
yeah,
And
well,
then you
yeah,
start to connect the dots. Now, here's the other thing, Jason. There is no direct evidence with just about any conspiracy. Because once there's direct evidence, it's no longer really a conspiracy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Everything is circumstantial. But people get convicted every day in court here in the United States on a good circumstantial case. So that's the other thing I get a lot. People will say, well, where specifically does it say this? Where specifically does it say that? Well, okay, listen, it's a conspiracy. If you work for a corporation and you're in the rank and file doing your job in a cubicle every day, and upstairs they're talking about how to reduce your pay, how to take away your benefits, who's going to get laid off, there's a conspiracy taking place above your head. You know, you don't know about it. You don't know about it until it starts to happen. But sometimes rumblings come out about what's taking place upstairs, and people will talk about it. Oh, that's just hearsay. Again, until it happens, until people lose their salaries, they lose their jobs, they lose their benefit coverage. And it's no longer a conspiracy. So it's the same thing with anything that we look at, and it's the same thing with what I did with the Beatles. Once you build a big enough case and you find, as you mentioned before, I took the official narrative, and the official narrative has a lot of holes in it, a lot of holes in it.
Hmm.
And there are cracks in the dam, and you have to start looking at the cracks
Yeah.
and seeing if there's another narrative.
Well, let's get to some of the smoking guns, or at least the bullet shells lying around. Uh, I'm going to link to other interviews or presentations around rubber soul, so we don't have to go through all the minutiae. You don't have to do it for the thousandth time. But if you want to sum up, because there's so much of it seems to be to me around the circumstances of that album, just as a microcosmic example of what we're talking about. If you want to sum up what you discovered and how conclusive it ended up being for you around that period, that would be great.
Okay, so the first thing we probably should set the table with is that the Beatles were on the hook for two albums a year from 63 through 1966. And before we get to Rubber Soul, there, according to the official narrative, there was no problem with coming into the studio with music. But when we get to Rubber Soul, they come into the studio, into EMI, on October 11th of 1965 with essentially no music in the backlog. They didn't write any songs. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, if they know they're on the hook for two albums a year, why weren't they writing songs? Especially in 1965, because unlike 63 and 64, they had more time to do that, but it didn't get done. So we'll just keep that on the back burner because that's something that I think a lot of people miss. You have a job to do. You're responsible for a deliverable and you're not doing it. You're not working on the deliverable. So what happened was I bought a DVD deconstructing the Beatles, and this particular segment was about Rubber Soul. So I call it Deconstructing Rubber Soul, and the author of the series is a gentleman by the name of Scott Fryman. And Scott is a musicologist. He's very accomplished musically, and he is an expert on the Beatles. So Scott kicks off this, it's a filmed lecture, is what it was, presentation. And he kicks it off by saying that the Beatles came into the Rubber Soul sessions essentially empty. They had come off a tour, their US tour. They had a 6 week break after the tour. And after the 6 weeks, they entered EMI on October 11th of 65. Recording started the next day on October 12th of 1965. And they had to wrap up by November 11th of 1965. So 30 days. They had 30 days to write from scratch, learn the song. So what I mean by learn the songs is if John and or Paul write a song, they then have to take that song to George and Ringo, explain the song, play it through, get the arrangements down, the basic arrangements down, and then that would lead to rehearsal. And they got to rehearse because you're not going to rehearse before you record. And then there's going to be a further arrangement, either by the Beatles themselves or by George Martin. And then now it's time to record the song and then mix it down. All of that had to get done in 30 days. And the reason why they had to wrap up by November 11th of 1965 is because they needed to get Rubber Soul on the shelves in retail by December 3rd of 1965 in time for the Christmas season. It was going to be a huge cash flow for EMI. Any Beatle record at that time was brought in a lot of revenue to the company. So when I listened to this presentation by Scott Fryman, I got about 15, 20 minutes in, and I said, this didn't happen. I've been writing songs since the late 1970s. I'm a guitar player. I've been in and out of studios. I have today, I have my home recording studio, oops, right here over to my right. And I said, there's no way that they wrote from scratch 16 songs in 30 days and recorded them. It was 14 songs for the album and 2 songs for a double A side single, which was We Can Work It Out and Day Tripper. And if you take a look at the timeline throughout October and November, the Beatles are just cranking these songs out like it's widgets on a manufacturing line. Songwriting is a process, and it's not just about writing the music. You also have to come up with the lyrics. So a lot of people just want to believe it was magical,
Hmm.
that the music and the lyrics just fell out of the sky, landed in their laps, and that's how it worked. And the reasoning that, well, it could be done because they were the Beatles is ridiculous, quite
That's
frankly.
circular. It's a bit circular, and it does raise the question. I wonder if you consider this, like, because if this was an engineered project, and your thesis basically that they were given the songs and all the rest of it, why have an official narrative that does raise these questions, unless it is to try and cement the idea that they're super geniuses? I mean, is that would that be
Yeah,
a way to explain it? Because it definitely does raise a question. Oh my God, they wrote 16 songs in 30 days under the gun. That's incredible. They must be geniuses because the other alternative wouldn't even occur to
yeah.
people.
The Beatles, the Beatles are portrayed as supernatural, a supernatural force. They're geniuses. They can do things that no mortal songwriter or musician can do. That's the story,
Right. So it's very
right?
convenient. And so it
So
has a double function because it covers up the truth, but it also generates the myth.
yeah, and it's hitting people at an emotional level because people love these types of stories. Who doesn't love the Beatles' official narrative? I loved it, the
Mm.
Cinderella story.
Because they were
It's
convincing as, I mean, you touched on this, but as personalities, they were incredibly convincing as something. Like now, I mean, now we think that's what geniuses are like so charismatic and funny and blah blah blah. But actually, maybe it's more like the monkeys. They were fantastic performers
they
that
were
somehow
performers,
played the part of superstars so
right?
well.
The Beatles were performers. So we have now the other thing too, Jason, some people want to argue with me and say, well, they did have some songs when they came into the Rubber Soul sessions. They had 2 or 3 songs or 4 songs, but that's not true either. So what happened was that when they came in, the official narrative tells us that they had partials of We Can Work It Out and Michelle. Now, if you have a partial song, you still have to work the song. You have to complete the writing of the song. I mean, I have a lot of partial songs. So if I brought it into a studio, I say, okay, well, I've got a little something here, but now I've got to complete it. I have to fill it out. They there was another song, What Goes On, and the official narrative tells us that that was brought in from very early on. It's claimed that John wrote that song in 1959, but the official narrative tells us that the only thing that they kept from that song is the chorus. Everything else was revamped and rewritten. So It wasn't the song from 1959. It's a different song that happened to retain the original chorus. And then we're told that they brought the song Wait in from the Help sessions, which took place earlier in the year. But even Wait wasn't a completed song. They still had to come in and they had to do overdubs, vocal overdubs, and some other overdubs. And I think they did that on the very last day on November 11th. In fact, they completed 4 songs on November 11th of 1965, which is just crazy within itself.
Hmm.
So the problem with Rubber Soul, what I tell people is if you don't like the number 16, pick a number. 10, 12, 14, pick a number. In Mark Lewison's book, Mark is considered to be the expert on Beatles history. In one of his books, and I have it here, he said that for the Rubber Soul sessions, the Beatles had to write from scratch more than a dozen songs. Now, what does more than a dozen mean? It means 13, 14, 15, or 16 songs. In a Beatles monthly magazine going back to 1965, October of 1965, it's an official Beatles uh, magazine. Paul McCartney was asked about the Rubber Soul sessions, and he said they don't have anything up their sleeve right now. The cupboard's bare. That's going back to 65, and we're talking about biological Paul McCartney. We're not talking about Billy. So where we can settle with this thing is they essentially came in, like Scott Fryman said, essentially empty. And again, if somebody wants to argue they had 2 songs, 3 songs, knock yourself out. Because I don't care if they had to write 12 or 14 songs.
So
It's still a lot of music to write from scratch
if this
in 30
wasn't the
days.
Beatles, this wouldn't be unusual, right? It wouldn't be unusual for a band that was being marketed, that was becoming a big thing, to go into a studio and be given a bunch of songs, right? And studio musicians and right but they wouldn't have to fake it because it was no big deal, right? What I'm trying to suggest is that although the template that you're presenting for Rubber Soul is controversial for all the reasons you know, forward and backwards, it wasn't that unusual actually
No,
before or after. And if you look at the 90s with boy bands, this kind of thing just became the normal, the
it's
standard.
always been like that. It goes back to Tin Pan Alley. It's always been like that. So when you think about it, the Beatles were really an exception to the rule.
Right.
And remember, I said that the Beatles were on the hook for 2 albums a year. So after the Help album was released, what happened? Did everybody go to sleep? Nobody was checking in with John and Paul. Hey guys, we've got a another recording session in October for the Christmas season. We're going to need 16 songs, 14 for the album, 2 for a single. So Brian Epstein didn't reach out to them and say, how are we coming along? George Martin didn't ask Brian, or George Martin didn't go to the Beatles directly and say, how's it going along, coming along? Because we've got a lot of music that we're going to be recording in October. And so I'm hoping you guys are progressing.
Right.
What happened to the communications? No, what happens is they just show up with basically nothing. So this is, we should be asking questions, is what I'm saying. And that's what I did. I started asking questions. Now, the other thing too is a very interesting, Paul McCartney, biological Paul McCartney, made very two important comments. One in June of 1966 at the Hilton in Japan. And when the Beatles were asked about their musicianship, Paul McCartney said, we never said that we were great musicians. We're adequate. Okay. Now, he said this as they just finished up recording their 7th studio album, Revolver, which is the album after Rubber Soul. Then on August 5th of 1966, the BBC interviews John and Paul at Paul's home. And during that interview, Paul repeats what he said back earlier in Japan. He said that we are not great musicians. And he also said that they wrote their music in great big batches. So let's take the musicianship piece of it first. To be just an adequate musician and to plow through what they had to plow through in 30 days at Rubber Soul, it's not going to cut it. So as an example, let me do this real quick. I'm just going to give you a sample. So we're told that they arrived in the studio per Scott Fryman's presentation on October 11th of 65, the very next day, the first day of recording.
You know what day that is? October 12th. Sorry to add more spice. It's Crowley's birthday.
Crowley's birthday.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. So Run for Your Life, October 12th, they they complete the recording of Run for Your Life. The second day in on the 13th, Drive My Car is in the bag. On the fifth day, Day Tripper is knocked out. On the seventh day, If I Needed Someone is done. On October 21st, Norwegian Wood is in the bag. On October 22nd, they bang out two songs, In My Life and Nowhere Man. And 18 days in, We Can Work It Out. And then we have the same progression as we move through November. And it gets really weird in November because on the very last day, we're told that they completed the recording of four songs on the very last day in one long session. I think it went like 12 to 13 hours. You Won't See Me and Girl, which according to the official narrative says that those songs didn't exist before November 11th, which means what? They wrote them that day and then they learned them, they rehearsed them, and then they recorded them. They finished Wait from the Help sessions. Remember, I said that they pulled that one in. They had to do some overdubs. And they finished up I'm Looking Through You. So four songs on the very last day. So when you take a look at how this marches along, this is not reality. It's simply not. And what I explain to my audience, because I have a lot of musicians and songwriters, sound engineers, and some producers who follow my work, what we will say is for musicians and songwriters, sound engineers and producers who are honest and not looking to either one want to believe the story under any circumstance. In other words, we're just going to defend the Beatles story because I like the story. Or they know the truth, but they won't speak the truth. Because if they speak the truth, especially if they're in the industry, it's pretty much the kiss of death to talk about it
Mm.
because it would be heresy. And I've had people write me and say, look, Mike, I've got information for you. I'm going to share it, but please do not tell anybody, don't talk about where you got this information from
Mm.
because they're very concerned about it. They don't want to be they don't want to be persona non grata in the music industry or called a kook and then the work dries up. So, they'll steer clear of that. So when we go through how these songs are banged out, Jason, in this amount of time, again, it's not reality. And we're told that not one of these songs took more than 5 takes. Not one song took more than 5 takes in the studio. Now, if we fast forward to the White Album sessions in 1968, and we take a look at the number of takes that the Beatles did for those songs, we're talking about dozens 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. I think there was 100 takes for Not Guilty, which is a George Harrison song that didn't make it onto the White Album.
Mm.
So how did they go from 5 takes with Rubber Soul, not exceeding 5 takes for any one song for the Rubber Soul sessions, to in 1968 to dozens and dozens and dozens of takes for the songs on the White Album?
Mm. So is your view of the later Beatles album that there was some songwriting going on and there was some more active participation from the group?
I'm sorry?
Your view is that with the later albums, they were doing some songwriting and becoming more actively involved.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So my take on it is my position. I concluded that from 1962 through 1966, the Beatles wrote little to nothing. The Beatles were too busy being the veneer, the performers, out on the world stage. They were doing nonstop touring, especially when they hit the United States in February of 1964 going forward. They were very busy the year prior in 1963 out in the UK. They were doing press conferences. They were doing promotions. They were on TV shows. They did 2 films. So we've got all of this activity taking place. And in the Beatles documentary, The Complete Beatles, there's a segment in that documentary. Now, this was considered the Beatles documentary before Anthology was released in 1990. It explains that their touring was exhaustive, exhaustive. And so the narrative wants to tell us that two things. One, they'll say that it was exhaustive, and then they'll say that the Beatles were a perpetual um, writing machine. They were always writing. They were writing when they were on tour. They were writing on film sets. They were writing in the studio. They were writing when they were on holiday or vacation. They were writing all the time. Going back to the August 5th, 1966 interview that Paul McCartney and John Lennon did with the BBC, Paul McCartney, I'm talking about biological Paul McCartney, blew that out of the water. Paul said, "We don't write in between albums." Then he pauses and he says, "Normally," he caught himself, but he was going to say, "We don't write in between albums, period." But then he said, "We don't write in between albums normally. Maybe one or two. We write in great big batches
Mm.
whenever we need to come in to do a record." And then the BBC interviewer says, "I always thought it was quite impossible to write that many songs on the spot or in a short span of time." And John Lennon says it is sometimes. It's quite impossible. And then both John and Paul go on to explain that for Revolver, because the interview took place the day that Revolver was released. They say, well, for the last album, it took us weeks to write just one song. Weeks to write one song for Revolver. Okay, well, if it took you weeks to write one song for Revolver, how did you write 12, 14, 16 songs for Rubber Soul in 30 days? How did you do that? So there's these types of inconsistencies in the story, and the Beatles themselves were dropping clues. They were dropping hints as to what was really going on. Now, the other problem with Rubber Soul, because some people still want to believe that because they were magical and brilliant, that they wrote all these songs in 30 days because, well, because they're the Beatles. Um, the other problem with it is the manufacturing cycle time does not work. It does not work. And if you look at the Beatles' official narrative, they just skim right over that part of it.
Mm.
And so do you want me to go through that quickly?
Sure.
Okay. I don't want to occupy time here that
It
if you,
is,
you know,
it is a pretty conclusive argument. So yeah, might as well.
okay.
Yeah.
So the Beatles, EMI cuts the final mono lacquer on November 17th. So the Beatles finish up recording. It's supposed to be November 11th, but it goes into the very early morning hours of November 12th. We're told that George Martin wraps up the final mixing on November 15th, and he completes the song sequencing on November 16th. Now, song sequencing is very, very important, and I'll get back to it in a moment. The next day, November 17th, we're told that the final mono lacquer was cut. Now, when the final lacquer is cut, that means you can start the pressing process. You can create the stampers and start pressing the vinyl. And so from the 17th of November to December 3rd, when the records ended up in retail, that's 2.5 weeks. So we're to believe that the entire manufacturing process took 2.5 weeks. And remember, back in the day, when we talk about distribution, there's no digital media. Everything's got to be staged and then loaded up on trucks and delivered out to the retail outlets. Back then, there were no big box stores. Everything was local record stores, retail outlets that were going to carry the records. So there was a lot of transportation that was taking place to get all of this stuff out, to get the records out. Now, I was working with somebody when I did my big presentation back in April of 2020, did the Beatles write all their own music, where I brought this to the forefront, who has been in the music business for a very long time and is very familiar with the vinyl pressing process. And he explained to me that back in the day, it was at a minimum 2 months from the time that the final lacquer is cut to when the album made its way out into retail. So in the case of the Beatles, the final lacquer was cut on November 17th. That means that we shouldn't have seen the record in stores until January 17th or later. So, it was explained to me that 8 weeks could be 10 weeks. That was the cycle time.
Right.
Why do you need that cycle time? You need that cycle time because you have to print. There's a couple of things you have to do. You have to print the center labels. You've got to print the album jackets. The labels and the jackets the ink has to dry. Back in the day, they were using four-color printing with the rollers. It took a week for the ink to dry before they could handle the slicks for the album covers. Everything has to be proofed. And then once everything's proofed and it's ready to go, it gets shipped out. The final product gets shipped out. Now, you can't do the labels and you can't do the album jackets until the song sequencing is done because the center labels and the back of the album jackets contain the names of the songs in sequenced order.
And the length.
I'm sorry?
And the length of the songs, no?
Yes, the run times. Although I think Rubber Soul, because I have original copies, left off the run times from the original pressings.
Hmm.
But the names of the songs in sequenced order. Now, if George Martin didn't finish up the sequencing until November 16th, how did all of those labels and all of those album jackets make their way to the pressing plant 24 hours later on November 17th? How did it happen? And here's the other problem that they have. The center labels for a vinyl record, whether it be a 33 RPM or a 45, they are adhered to the record at the exact same time that the album is pressed. It's not adhered to later, which means the labels had to be in-house, on standby, and ready for when the pressing process began. That did not take place within a 24-hour window of time. It just did not. So what did happen? What happened was the Beatles didn't write any of those songs for Rubber Soul. Those songs were written by outside ghostwriters, and the instrumentation, the music, was recorded by studio musicians way beforehand, weeks, months in advance. Because it was done weeks and months in advance, once the songs were written and they were recorded without the vocals, George Martin had the instrumentals. George Martin now knew that he knew the names of the songs. After they did editing, because in all likelihood they do editing on just about every song. It's a process called comping, but I won't get into that. They then had the final version of the instrumental track of the song, which means now they had the run times. So they had the names of the songs, they had the run times, and this allowed George Martin to do the sequencing. Now, the sequencing is important because it does two things. One, it establishes the flow of the record. How many songs are on side A? How many songs are on side B? And by the way, the Beatles, aside from in the early days, with the exception of A Hard Day's Night, did 7 songs per side, 14 songs, 7 and 7. Goes back to Crowley or Crowley's book, 77.
777. 3 sevens.
And the 3 sevens.
Yeah.
Triple sevens, yeah. So what happened was George Martin was able to start the printing process way before the Beatles ever arrived in the studio on October 11th of 1965. That process was well underway. So when the Beatles arrived, George Martin now has the instrumental tracks, and in all likelihood, there were guide vocals so that the Beatles could learn the vocals and learn the harmonies. That's what they did for 30 days. The Beatles learned and then sang the vocals for the Rubber Soul album.
Is it
That's
possible, I mean, as an in-between argument that the music was written and the titles were decided so that they could prepare all that, but that the Beatles were given a little wiggle room to write a few lyrics? Have you
no,
considered that as, no, that's not.
no. Look, see, here's the thing. The other thing we have to understand is we'd have to believe the Rubber Soul story. We would have to believe that EMI would have just winged it. In other words, they had no guarantees based upon how the official narrative is presented to us. If you were an executive at EMI, Sir Joseph Lockwood, or if you were George Martin, you would say, what are you guys talking about? I have a deliverable. We have a deliverable that has to be out in the stores by December 3rd of 65 in time for the Christmas season. And we're going to come into the studio and try to figure it out,
Hmm.
whether they had any input or not. Nobody in the record industry is going to fly by the seat of their pants like that. Because what could have happened and what would have happened if that were the case, if the official narrative were actually how it worked, no album would have been produced. And heads would have rolled at EMI Parlophone.
Mm.
So a lot of people, see, a lot of folks just don't want to give up on the Beatles had something to do with the songs. They had to have had something to do with the songs. They had
Well, I
to,
mean, that's where I was going to go because I mean, I've never been a major Beatles fan, but you said that you have been. So,
yeah.
what's it like for you now, now that you're convinced that you were completely wrong in the past? I don't know, do you still listen to the Beatles?
Yeah, I mean, once in a while, I'll go back and listen to some of the albums. I still have a collection of the vinyl. Like I said, I sold off probably around 75% of it,
Right.
but I have albums that are worth a lot of money, Jason. They're investments. I have some
I
very
just,
early
I was
pressings.
just
I'll go back
curious
and listen to them.
whether you can still enjoy them, was what I was wondering.
Yeah,
So,
I enjoy. I can appreciate the craftsmanship behind the music because it was a lot of very well written music, regardless of who wrote it.
yeah, and but do you still experience a cognitive dissonance now when you listen to those early songs, and because presumably what we would have to extrapolate from this version of things is that the John Lennon personality or the Paul McCartney personality, which is less formed, I think, that seems to be coming through those early songs, wasn't right because he didn't write he didn't write like the lyrics or the music, but the way that we've grown up on the Beatles is that there were these two personalities and that
Right.
had different styles. And even though it said Lennon and McCartney wrote everything, which is an interesting clue in itself that they had that, they imposed some false reality in a way that everybody knows because they didn't write them separately or even in the official version. But anyway, this sense of John Lennon's personality evolving through the music clearly by your interpretation is false. So what's it like when you listen back? Like, because there are some of those early songs that do seem like John Lennon finding his sensibility, right? Or did.
It's it's John Lennon. It's John Lennon playing out a script, is what it is. So when we did the analysis back in April of 2020, again, I had a person on the team that is very accomplished. He went back and listened to the early music, and we're talking about the period between 62 and 66.
Mhm.
And he said to me, Mike, I've studied this and studied this, and what I'm hearing is two distinct styles, songwriting styles.
Mhm.
So what I deducted was that there were two teams. In all likelihood, two very small teams of maybe two to three songwriters that were responsible for writing McCartney types of music, style of music, and another two or three songwriters that were responsible for writing John Lennon style songs. So that's how you get the distinction.
Mhm.
Now, the narratives around, well, this is, this sounds like John finding himself. This sounds like John really liking Bob Dylan and this and that. We hear all of these stories.
Mhm.
They're stories. They're just stories. What people know about the Beatles, because nobody knows them personally,
Mhm.
aside from the people who are in the inner circle, I'm talking about the fan base.
Yeah.
They have gathered and assimilated from documentaries, from books, from magazines, from just all kinds of stories that are out there. So when they tell us this is Paul McCartney evolving or John Lennon evolving, well, how do you know that? Yeah, but you don't know Paul McCartney, you don't know John Lennon. I'm not talking about you personally. I'm talking to people who say this. I guess because I get these types of questions all the time.
Mhm.
You don't you don't you don't know them. You weren't with them when they were kids, when they were teenagers, when they were the Beatles. You didn't have lunch with them, you didn't have dinner with them, you didn't go drinking with them, you didn't go smoking with them. You didn't do any of that stuff with them. You only know what you think you know because you have consumed the official narrative.
Mhm.
It's a gigantic story.
Mhm.
Now, are there elements of truth in the official narrative? Of course, there's going to be threads of truth. But the threads, what I have found, the threads of truth are the things that don't mean a whole lot. It would be Billy or Paul McCartney arrived at EMI Studios on this day. Is that true? Yeah, he showed up on that day at EMI Studios. But I'm talking about that's the facade, that's the veneer. I'm talking about we're getting into like the deep stuff. What's really going on behind the curtain? What's really going on? What and you know this, Jason, what they do is they give the Joe Q public, they give them the official narrative, they give them the story, and people believe it. It's like I took a look at some of your posts on Twitter, and you got into the whole Trump thing
Mhm.
and how people are enamored and believing that he's going to save them. Am I wrong? That's what your posts were, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
It's
it's not going to happen. Again, it's the public is very gullible.
mhm.
The masses are extremely gullible and they are fractured and they have this disparate belief system. There's all of this infighting. If you don't believe what I believe, then I'm not talking to you, or you're a conspiratard, or you're an idiot. There's all of this fighting and rock throwing that goes back and forth, and that's why humanity is never going to be able to find their way out of a paper bag if this continues.
Mhm.
But it's no different with the Beatles. See, the thing is, people have to understand is that you take a step back, especially for all of those talking to the audience here, for all the folks that are into the conspiracy research and taking a look into the truth and all that stuff. And you understand that many aspects of our reality is controlled. Why wouldn't the biggest band in the world, why would they have not been controlled?
Mhm.
How could Why is it that you would believe that four working class guys out of Liverpool, by their own admission, were mediocre musicians at best, especially when they arrived in Hamburg, that they showed no songwriting prowess, according to their producer, George Martin? How is it that they got to achieve what they achieved, the trajectory? How did that happen? Because they were organic? No, no, that's just, I mean, I'll give you my opinion. That's just silly to believe that all of that took place organically. There was a machine behind them. That's how it took place. The Beatles arrived in Hamburg in August of 1960. They were there for 4 months. It didn't go anywhere. It was it went nowhere. But they were doing what young guys do. They were drinking, popping a couple of pills, playing on stage for 7 hours a night, hanging out with the ladies. That they were enjoying themselves. They were four young guys doing what young men do, especially when they're away from home and there's nobody watching them. There's no supervision. They're just going to go do what young guys do. And then in 1961, beginning in January 1961, this band that didn't prove themselves, not great musicians, no signs of any songwriting ability. All of a sudden, they start getting all of these gigs virtually every day, locally within Liverpool and outside of Liverpool. Well, how are they getting all these gigs? They're not that great a band. Who's signing them? Who's telling them, yeah, come on in and play? So then on January 1st of 1962, this band that has no track record They walk into Decca Records to do an audition. Hold on a second. Again, what is their resume? What got them from August of 1960 and then 16 months later sitting in Decca Records cutting an audition, doing a demo? How'd that happen? And then in February of 1962, Brian Epstein takes the tapes to George Martin. George Martin says, nope, not going to sign them. Based upon what you're showing me, I'm not interested. Now they've been rejected by Decca. Now they've been rejected by EMI Parlophone. And then miraculously, in March of 1962, the BBC picks them up. The BBC, Live at the BBC gigs begin, which runs from March of 1962 out into 1965. Well, how did they get on the BBC?
Mhm.
Decca turned them down. EMI turned them down. They've got nothing behind them. In fact, George Martin, a number of interviews, but one in particular, said that even though the Beatles had nothing behind them, he liked them. They had charisma. That's
Mhm.
what it was all about. It was about stage presence. It was about performance. It was, they were a veneer for what they were going to become. What the machine put them out front and built this whole backstory,
Mhm.
and that their job was to make their strategy come to life. You know. Anyway, so then in February 7th of 1964, they're in the United States. They land in the U.S. at Kennedy Airport. And the tagline was the Beatles conquer America. Conquer America. So from the time they arrived in Hamburg in August of 1960 to the day they landed in America on February 7th of 1964 was only 3.5 years.
Mhm.
Rockets on their shoes. We have to ask the question, how did that happen? I don't care how talented you might think somebody is. I don't care how great a musician you think somebody is. That is an incredible rate and pace. And my argument is that it was not organic. It was not natural. There was a massive machine behind them that was pushing them along because there was a massive agenda that they were going to be involved in. And they were the first manufactured band with the responsibility of social engineering at a worldwide level.
Right. Well, that is the counter narrative, and as I said, I'm like Mulder. I want to believe it because there's so much evidence, but I want it to make sense and be coherent. And so it's helpful talking to you. And we were talking about how much resistance you encounter to this narrative. And I think that it's, in a way, I mean, this can be a bit circular, but in a way, that's kind of evidence of how effective it's been. Because I think what is suggested by this counter narrative is, as we just said, they were the first manufactured band. So I guess before the Beatles, it really wasn't a big deal if a band wrote its own music or its own songs. This whole idea that a band was supposed to be a bunch of not just charismatic figures, but geniuses.
Right.
That came about with the Beatles, I think, right? Because Elvis
Yep.
didn't write his own songs and nobody cared
No.
about that, right? So even a single singer, Bob Dylan was probably the beginning of the songwriter myth as well. Maybe I'll have to bust him next. But anyway, um, that it's decades since then, and of course, since the Beatles, we don't know how many of the bands that came after the Beatles, not counting the Monkees, were manufactured, and we don't know how much of it was an effective sort of mimetic thing where bands did become more and more, aspiring to become the way that they thought the Beatles were. But the fact is that decades later, that is the model that people were born into and grew up with.
Right.
This
And
idea,
that
yeah,
and that other bands and singers and songwriters and artists emulated.
yeah.
So that's the other thing that people will the question they'll ask me. Are you saying that you know nobody writes their own music? No, I never said that. The Beatles were put out there as a template. And in order to get it going, the machine had to build it, had to build a foundation, build a house, sell them, market them, and push them, push to make them larger than life. And they succeeded. They made them larger than life. And then what happened was they created an entire genre of music. And other bands came along And there was a process of emulation, an emulation of the sound, an emulation of the lyrics, an emulation of the theme of the music, issues that were being pushed,
Hmm.
all of that. And because let's face it, human beings, they emulate, they mirror.
Hmm.
Hey, it worked for the Beatles. Look how successful they are. We should do the same thing or something very similar.
Hmm.
And I will argue, and I have argued, that the entire British invasion, that's why it's called a British invasion, coming out of Britain, masterminded by the Tavistock Institute, which had ties back to the Frankfurt School, was a creation of the, for lack of a better term, the deep state, Tavistock included. The Tavistock is a main driver. Um, and I believe that the powers that be are responsible for all of the genres of music that are pushed into the mainstream pop arena. There are indie artists out there. I'm not talking about indie. I'm an indie artist. But if you got signed to a major label and you're getting airplay and you're on TV shows and you're doing halftime shows at Super Bowls and that sort of thing, Taylor Swift is another one. Taylor Swift a, a later iteration of what the Beatles were all about. And she has her entire cult of followers that they call the Swifties. Also, Tavistock gave the tagline to the Beatles, like what they call it, Beatlemania. Beatlemania. What is a mania? Mania is to hype up, to make excitable. So that's the thing. Words have meaning. These slogans that they put out there. Frankfurt School was huge on slogans. They talked about it. They said, put slogans. People love slogans. They repeat them. So just put some simple words out there in slogans, and people will carry that to the bank.